The rumble of the moving truck echoed through the dense woods, a jarring intrusion on the eerie silence that had settled over this place for centuries. My parents, ever the adventurous spirits, had purchased the old abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the Devil's Tramping Ground. A steal, my dad had called it, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a challenge. I, however, felt a shiver crawl down my spine the moment we turned onto the dirt road leading to the property. The house itself was a monstrosity, a Gothic Victorian relic with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Vines thick as pythons snaked up the walls, their tendrils reaching towards the gaping windows like skeletal fingers. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and an unnatural stillness permeated the surroundings. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. As we unloaded boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of fear through me. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the overgrown lawn. With nightfall, the temperature plummeted, and a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the house in an oppressive silence. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The old house groaned and settled around me, a symphony of unsettling noises. Then I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps pacing back and forth just outside my window. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be circling the house. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, then abruptly stopped. The next morning I found my parents in the kitchen, their faces pale and drawn. "Did you hear it?" my mom whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They had heard the footsteps too. We tried to rationalize it, blaming it on animals or the wind, but deep down, we all knew that something was terribly wrong. Days turned into weeks, and the nightly footsteps became a terrifying ritual. We began to notice other strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers carried on the wind, and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the periphery. The atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension and fear, and we were all constantly on edge. One evening, while exploring the attic, I stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of dusty furniture. The journal belonged to the previous owner of the house, a man named Elias, who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. As I turned the brittle pages, a chilling entry caught my eye. The circle feeds on fear. It grows stronger with every sleepless night, every terrified scream. We are prisoners in our own home, trapped in a nightmare from which there is no escape. A wave of icy dread washed over me. Elias's words confirmed our worst fears. We were not alone in this house. Something sinister was lurking in the shadows, something ancient and malevolent, and it was feeding on our terror. Elias's journal became my obsession. I devoured every word, desperate for answers, for some clue as to what we were dealing with. Elias described the entity as a shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that burned like hot coals. He wrote of its ability to manipulate the environment, to conjure chilling hallucinations, and to prey on the deepest fears of its victims. One passage in particular sent a chill down my spine. It whispers my name in the dead of night, a voice like dry leaves skittering across cracked earth. It shows me visions of my loved ones, twisted and tormented, their screams echoing in my ears until I can no longer tell what is real and what is merely a figment of its wicked design. Fear became our constant companion. We jumped at every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. Sleep became a luxury we could no longer afford, the nightly footsteps a constant reminder of the entity's presence. My parents, once so vibrant and full of life, were now shadows of their former selves, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. One night the entity escalated its torment. As we huddled together in the living room, the lights began to flicker violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. The temperature plummeted, and a bone-chilling cold seeped into our bones. Then the furniture began to move, sliding across the floor as if pushed by unseen hands. A vase shattered against the wall, and a painting flew off its hook, crashing to the floor with a deafening bang. My mother screamed, burying her face in her hands. My father, his face pale with terror, pulled us close, trying to shield us from the unseen force that was tearing our world apart. Suddenly, a heavy, antique mirror that hung above the fireplace came loose, crashing down towards us. I braced myself for the impact, but the mirror stopped inches from our heads, suspended in midair as if held by an invisible hand. Then a voice, raspy and ancient, filled the room. "Leave this place," it hissed, "or suffer the consequences." The mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the room. We scrambled back, our hearts pounding in our chests. The lights flickered once more and then plunged us into darkness. We huddled together, trembling in the inky blackness, the entity's chilling warning echoing in our ears. We had been given an ultimatum: leave or face the wrath of whatever malevolent force inhabited this cursed land. The entity's threat hung in the air like a toxic fume. We knew we couldn't stay, not after that terrifying display of power. But leaving meant abandoning our home, our belongings, everything we had ever known. The next morning, the fear had given way to a grim determination. We packed our essentials, the silence in the house punctuated only by the rustle of clothes and the clatter of boxes. As we loaded the car, I couldn't help but steal one last glance at the house, its dark windows seeming to watch our every move. We drove away with a sense of urgency, the dirt road disappearing behind us in a cloud of dust. But even as we put distance between ourselves and the devil's tramping ground, the feeling of dread lingered. We were not free, not yet. The entity's warning echoed in my mind. Leave this place, or suffer the consequences. What were those consequences? We checked into a motel in the nearest town, a bleak, run-down establishment that mirrored our own despair. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the faded wallpaper and threadbare carpet. We were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but sleep remained elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the entity's burning eyes and heard its raspy voice. The next day, we tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. We went to a diner for breakfast, the chatter of other patrons a welcome distraction from our own troubled thoughts. But the food tasted like ash in my mouth, and the cheerful atmosphere felt jarringly out of place. We were like ghosts, haunting the edges of a world that no longer felt like our own. As we left the diner, I noticed a man sitting at a corner table, watching us intently. He was old, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. He wore a worn flannel shirt and a trucker hat, and a strange, unsettling aura emanated from him. He beckoned me over. Hesitantly, I approached his table. "You're the folks who moved into the old farmhouse, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I nodded, unable to speak. "You shouldn't have gone there," he continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "That place is cursed. It ain't natural." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've stirred something up, son, something evil, and it ain't gonna let you go that easy." His words sent a shiver down my spine. We weren't just dealing with a haunting. We were caught in the crosshairs of something far more sinister, something that had followed us from that cursed place. And as I looked back at the old man, a chilling realization dawned on me. He wasn't warning us, he was relishing our fear. He was part of it. The old man's words sent a chill down my spine. We weren't just dealing with a haunting, we were caught in the crosshairs of something far more sinister, something that had followed us from that cursed place. And as I looked back at the old man, a chilling realization dawned on me. He wasn't warning us, he was relishing our fear. He was part of it. I turned away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to tell my parents, had to warn them that we were in even deeper trouble than we had imagined. But as I walked back to the car, I saw the old man watching me, his eyes gleaming with a twisted amusement. I felt a surge of anger, a burning desire to confront him, to demand answers. But I knew it was pointless. He wasn't going to tell me anything, not if it meant revealing his own involvement in whatever was happening. We left the diner, leaving the old man behind, but his chilling words echoed in my mind. "You've stirred something up, son, something evil, and it ain't gonna let you go that easy." The next few days were a blur. We tried to find a new place to live, but every house we looked at seemed to have its own dark secrets. We were like ghosts, haunted by the entity that had followed us from the devil's tramping ground. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I felt a presence in the room. I could sense it watching me, its eyes boring into my soul. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but the feeling of being watched was relentless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know you're there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know you're watching me." There was a pause, and then I heard it. The same raspy voice that had spoken to us from the mirror. "Yes, I'm here," it said, its voice echoing through the room. "I've been watching you for a long time." I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I knew I was in danger, but I couldn't bring myself to run. I was trapped, both physically and emotionally. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I want what I always want," the entity replied, its voice taking on a sinister tone. "I want your fear." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that the entity was feeding on our fear, that it was using it to grow stronger, but I didn't understand why it was targeting me specifically. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Because you're special," the entity said, its voice taking on a mocking tone. "You're different from the others." I didn't understand what it meant. I was just a normal person, scared and alone. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You have a connection to the darkness," the entity said, its voice growing louder. "A connection that I can use to my advantage." I felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that I had never felt before. I knew that the entity was trying to manipulate me, to use me for its own evil purposes. But I couldn't resist its power, its seductive allure. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Nothing," the entity said, its voice taking on a soothing tone. "Just be yourself. Just let your fear flow freely." I closed my eyes, letting the darkness consume me. I felt the entity's presence growing stronger, its power coursing through my veins. I was no longer in control, I was just a vessel for its evil. The next morning I woke up with a start. I felt drained and exhausted, but I knew that something had changed. I was no longer the same person I was before. I had been touched by the darkness, and it had left its mark on me. I looked around the room and I saw the entity standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. I knew that it was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I knew that I had to leave, had to escape from its clutches. But I was too weak, too afraid. I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I was no longer just a scared boy. I was a pawn in a deadly game, a puppet in the hands of the darkness. And I knew that I was going to lose. The days that followed were a horrifying descent into madness. The entity's presence became a constant in my life, a dark passenger that whispered insidious suggestions and twisted my perception of reality. It preyed on my insecurities, amplifying my fears and doubts until I could no longer distinguish between my own thoughts and its manipulative whispers. It showed me visions, horrific images of my parents suffering, their bodies contorted in agony, their screams echoing in my ears. It told me that it was my fault, that my fear was fueling their torment. I tried to resist, to fight against its influence, but I was growing weaker, my resolve crumbling under the weight of its relentless torment. One day, I found myself standing on the edge of a busy highway, cars whizzing past in a blur of motion. The entity's voice whispered in my ear, urging me to step into the oncoming traffic, to end it all and release myself from its grasp. I hesitated, my body trembling, my mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. Just as I was about to succumb to the entity's seductive call, a hand grabbed my arm, pulling me back from the brink. I turned to see my father, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Son, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his presence. For a moment, the entity's hold on me weakened, and I saw a flicker of hope in my father's eyes. But it was fleeting. The entity's grip tightened, and its voice filled my head, drowning out my father's pleas. "He can't save you," it hissed. "He's weak, just like your mother. They're both going to suffer because of you." I felt a surge of rage, a burning anger directed at my father, at his inability to protect us from this nightmare. I pushed him away, my voice filled with a venomous hatred I didn't recognize. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. "It's your fault! You brought us to this cursed place!" My father stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and hurt. I saw tears welling up in his eyes, but I couldn't feel any remorse. The entity had poisoned my mind, turning me against the people I loved most. I turned and ran, fleeing from my father, from the highway, from the world itself. I ran until I collapsed, exhausted and broken, in a deserted park. As I lay there gasping for breath, I realized the horrifying truth. The entity had won. It had twisted me into a weapon, a tool to inflict pain and suffering on my own family. And as the darkness closed in, I knew that there was no escape. I was lost, consumed by the entity's evil, destined to become its instrument of terror. The world became a hazy nightmare. Days blurred into nights, and the faces of strangers morphed into grotesque parodies of my loved ones. The entity's voice was my only constant, a sinister narrator guiding me through a macabre play of its own design. I wandered aimlessly, driven by a dark purpose I couldn't comprehend. I found myself drawn to places of despair, to the shadows where broken souls sought refuge. I saw the fear in their eyes, the same terror that had consumed me, and I felt a perverse satisfaction. The entity reveled in their fear, and I, its puppet, danced to its tune. One night I found myself standing outside my childhood home. The house was dark, the windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. A wave of nostalgia washed over me, a fleeting memory of a time before the darkness had consumed me. I entered the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I wandered from room to room, each one a ghost of a forgotten memory. In my parents' bedroom, I found a photograph on the nightstand. It was a picture of my family taken on a sunny afternoon in a park. We were all smiling, our faces filled with joy and love. I stared at the photograph, my heart aching with a longing I couldn't express. The entity's voice whispered in my ear, mocking my sentimentality. "They're gone," it hissed. "They're never coming back." I felt a surge of anger, a burning rage directed at the entity, at the world, at myself. I crumpled the photograph in my fist, tears streaming down my face. Suddenly, I heard a noise from downstairs. A floorboard creaked, followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest. Could it be? Could my parents be back? I crept down the stairs, my senses heightened. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, my body trembling with anticipation. I reached the bottom of the stairs and peered into the living room. A figure stood in the shadows, its back to me. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Dad?" The figure turned and my blood ran cold. It wasn't my parents. It was the entity, its form now fully materialized, its eyes burning like hot coals. "Hello," it said, its voice a raspy growl. "I've been expecting you." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The entity was here in my childhood home, the place where my nightmare had begun. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I want you to embrace your destiny," the entity replied, its voice echoing through the room. "I want you to become what you were always meant to be." It stepped closer, its form towering over me. I felt its power radiating from it, a dark energy that threatened to consume me. "Join me," it whispered, its voice seductive and alluring. "Become my heir, my instrument of terror. Together, we will rule the darkness." I hesitated, my mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. I knew that if I joined the entity, I would be condemning myself to an eternity of darkness. But I also knew that I couldn't escape its grasp. I was trapped, both physically and emotionally. I closed my eyes and I made my choice. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The entity smiled, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It reached out and touched my forehead, and I felt a surge of power coursing through my veins. The world around me dissolved and I was plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the devil's tramping ground. The barren circle of land stretched out before me, its silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I looked down at my hands and I saw that they were covered in blood. I looked up and I saw the entity standing before me, its form radiating with a dark power. "Welcome home," it said, its voice echoing through the night. I smiled, a twisted grin spreading across my face. I was no longer just a scared boy. I was the heir to the darkness, the instrument of terror, and I was ready to unleash my reign of fear upon the world. As I stood there, reveling in my newfound power, a chilling thought crept into my mind. Where were my parents? The entity had shown me visions of their suffering, but were they truly gone? Or were they, perhaps, trapped somewhere within this cursed place, their souls twisted and tormented, forever bound to the entity's will? And then I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was my mother's voice calling my name, her voice filled with a despair that chilled me to the bone. The entity's grip on me faltered. A flicker of doubt, a spark of humanity ignited within me. Was this truly the destiny I had chosen? Or was there still a chance, a glimmer of hope, that I could break free from the entity's grasp and save my parents from their eternal torment? The ending, it seemed, was not yet written. The battle between light and darkness raged on, and the fate of my soul and the souls of my parents hung in the balance. The whisper came again, a desperate plea cutting through the suffocating darkness that had enveloped me. It was my mother, her voice weak but unmistakable. A surge of guilt and love washed over me, shattering the entity's hold on my mind. I had to save them. I had to. But how? The entity was powerful, its influence deeply rooted within me. I felt its anger, a burning rage at my defiance. It tried to regain control, to drown out my mother's voice with its own insidious whispers, but this time, something had changed. The love for my parents, the memory of their smiles, their warmth, their love, it was stronger than the darkness. I focused on that love, clinging to it like a lifeline in a stormy sea. And then I remembered Elias's journal. He had written about the entity's weakness. Its power fed on fear, but it could be weakened by acts of courage and love. An idea sparked in my mind, a desperate gamble. I closed my eyes, picturing my parents, their faces etched with fear, their bodies bound by invisible chains. I imagined myself breaking those chains, freeing them from the entity's grasp. I poured all my love, all my hope, into that image, and I felt a surge of power, a different kind of power flowing through me. I opened my eyes and faced the entity, my fear replaced by a steely determination. "You will release them," I commanded, my voice surprisingly strong. "You will let them go!" The entity snarled, its eyes blazing with fury. "You dare defy me?" it roared. "You are mine! You belong to the darkness!" "I belong to love," I retorted, my voice ringing with newfound confidence. "And I will not let you hurt them anymore!" The entity lunged at me, its claws outstretched, but I stood my ground. I focused all my energy, all my love, into a single blinding burst of light. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, its power waning. I pressed my advantage, channeling every ounce of courage and love I possessed. The ground beneath me trembled, and the air crackled with energy. The entity screamed in rage and pain, its form dissolving into a swirling vortex of shadows. And then silence. The darkness lifted, and the familiar sounds of the forest returned. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I looked around, my heart pounding with hope. And there they were, my parents, standing a few feet away, their faces pale but unharmed. We rushed towards each other, embracing in a tight hug, tears of relief streaming down our faces. We were free. The entity was gone, vanquished by the power of love. But as we left the devil's tramping ground, hand in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The darkness still lingered in the world, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. But I also knew that as long as we held on to love, as long as we faced our fears with courage and compassion, we would always find a way to overcome the darkness. And so, we walked away from the cursed place, leaving behind the shadows and stepping into the light, forever changed by our encounter with the entity, but also forever bound by the love that had saved us.